What a complete disaster. Having finished Hollow Knight Silksong Act 3, I can safely say that this was one of the big disappointments of the year. I love the original Hollow Knight, so to see Silksong completely drop the ball was a disappointment to me. I was really expecting something solid, if not as good as the original game, but in the end, I got something that was just a complete waste of my time. So where exactly did it go wrong? What exactly happened with Silk Song? Because I think it's quite a bit different than what we all expected the game might turn out to be. It's interesting because initially my complaint was that it felt as if it was too much of the same, but not quite as good. The environments weren't well thought out. The characters weren't interesting. The platforming wasn't good. The bosses weren't fun to fight. Like, it just felt like more of the same. And that feeling kind of grew and developed into what I think of Silk Song now, that this game just was a bloated mess with nothing new to offer, no new interesting lore additions or character developments, and just an expansion pack to the original Hollow Knight, because this is what this is. This is not a fully fledged new release. This is not a new game. This is a DLC. It's shocking playing this game and seeing that boss animations are reused, that it's padded, that 90% of the playtime is just you running down hallways trying to get back to a boss. It is unbelievably awful just how poorly constructed this game is. It feels as if it was made to waste your time. And I feel like initially, the people who would make these observations about the boss design being lazy and that the levels not being fun to play were kind of dismissed as being casuals who were filtered by the difficulty. And it is very important that we acknowledge that a game being difficult or being challenging or people not being to beat it doesn't magically make it good, because this is the same problem I had with Dark Souls, where all the criticisms that you might have towards Dark Souls when in regards to the obtuseness of the mechanics or just the laziness of the boss design or the rehashed concepts or the general idea or gameplay loop, like, you can say that Dark Souls isn't fun, and what immediately happens is that people accuse you of being filtered by the difficulty, even if you're like me and have gotten through the entire thing several times. That is the observation I'm having with Silksong right now, is that this game is not very good, that it's not very fun to play, that there's not a whole lot to it, and yet because of the elitist fan base, there's this very real refusal from the community to acknowledge that this game is a massive step down from the original Hollow Knight when it comes to the world design, when it comes to the music, when it comes to the story, when it comes to the characters, when it comes to like the central mechanics. Silksong is just nowhere near the same level of quality. Playing this, I was struck by just how much more well-made, engaging, and fun the Metroid series is. I during my playthrough of Silksong, I stopped and played through Super Metroid again, and that game is over 30 years old now. It's this all-time classic, one of the best Nintendo games ever made, and it's actually fun to play. It has better mechanics, it has a higher skill ceiling. Beating Super Metroid and trying to beat your time is this incredible experience that I really recommend like hardcore fans really participate in. And I went ahead and started playing Metroid Zero Mission after that, and even though I've never been quite as fond of that one, I was struck by just how well designed and engaging it was compared to Silksong, with a more organic map, with better pacing, with better boss design, with better combat. Like the list goes on and on. Like Silksong at its core just feels derivative and just not all that inspired. In fact, there were plenty of times when I was playing this when I noticed that Silksong straight up ripped off Metroid. Like there's a boss in this game that straight up lifted from Metroid Zero Mission. So Silksong, for those of us who have actually played a lot of Metroid-like games, who have experience with the genre, who understand the what it should be like. Silksong comes off as this bloated mess that doesn't really come together. Like there have been so many times during this game where I had to stop what I was doing and just grind for rosaries or shards or whatever so I could pay for, some keys so I could go somewhere or some power up or piece of equipment when I really don't feel as if that was in any way necessary. Instead of hiding tools or upgrades like incrementally through the area, like rewarding you through exploration, they're all in shops that are hidden behind a arbitrary shopping system, forcing you to just grind resources so you can just buy the things you want. And it just feels like a complete waste. In fact, there are so many things in this game that just feel like they bloat the experience further. For example, the quest system. So instead of organically just uncovering just things that happen in the world and then just proceeding with it naturally, like the game requires you to take on quests through a wish board. And those take you all over the map, meeting all sorts of different characters to get all sorts of different rewards. But the thing is, Hollow Knight kind of had something similar by simply having NPCs move around the map and occasionally get into all sorts of situations. Like at its core, the wish system adds absolutely nothing. It doesn't feel organic. It doesn't feel natural. It feels very forced. There were so many times I was doing a quest and just asking all these weird questions about why was this board chosen? How did this person send a wish all across the map? Why am I being asked to do this? Like the list goes on and on and on. Like it just feels contrived. It just feels forced, and it just feels like lazy padding to something that really should have been organic world and level design, because there aren't that many NPCs in the game. There aren't that many quests. There aren't that many things going on. Like the way Hollow Knight did things like this came off as way more natural and engaging. This issue comes to a head in Act 3 or heading into Act 3 whenever, because once you beat the very uninspired and derivative Act 2, you are required to go all over the map doing all these different quests for all these different people to trigger Act 3. You have to buy maps from every single area. You have to commit to every single wish. You have to accomplish all this nonsense that really doesn't have anything to do with the overarching plot at all. You're going to be spending like 10 hours doing all this stuff, rounding up all these quest lines, meeting all these characters, and just interacting with the world. And what ends up happening really is that it just feels like a giant waste of time. I feel the final Act 3 should have been triggered by your actual actions. You know, Act 3 should have been a simple matter of just playing the needle in when you're taking down the final boss. That's it. That's really all that they needed to do. But instead, they locked that requirement behind a bunch of arbitrary nonsense that didn't really need to be done. The entire game feels like that, in fact. Like Act 2 feels completely pointless. And Act 3 just feels like padding. Act 3 just has you going through a lot of all of the old areas, triggering boss fights that weren't available in Act 2. Like there's nothing really to it. There's nothing to it. And all of it culminates in a fight with a character that I don't really care for or want to see, really. I think Lace is a brat. So, like, all of this feels completely pointless. There's nothing about this game that's innovative. There's nothing about it that's fun. There's nothing about it that's challenging. And I think that's the big takeaway from this is that Hollow Knight is not actually difficult because I think a lot of people would dispute you about this, like this idea that well, like you die a lot, so that means it's difficult. No. Like once you memorize the patterns, once you understand where everything is and how the easily telegraphed boss fights work, you are going to demolish everything in this game with very little effort. Like I remember when I beat Lost Lace, the final boss, the one that everyone's hyping up. I beat Act 1 and Act 2 over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. Very, very easily, and then finally beat Act 3. And I can tell you for a fact that I could do it again with very little effort because now I know how Act 3 works. I know how what the gimmicks are. I know what the pattern is. It is very easy to play the patterns in these games because the AI is so sloppy and repetitive that you can easily take advantage of all the bosses by simply knowing their patterns and how to take advantage of them. It is in that sense no different than Dark Souls. And I will say I suppose Silksong has proven itself to be a better game than Elden Ring. That's not saying much because at the very least I was able to finish it. At least I was able to just push through and just like at the very least finish the game as opposed to just being so bored of just how derivative and uninspired it was that I just had to stop. Like Silksong, at the very least, has proven itself to be better than Souls, because the game actually makes sense. The action is reasonably well thought out. The mechanics are somewhat different. Like it actually has fun character designs and actual, you know, thought put into the world and characters. But at the end of the day, being better than FromSlop is not an accomplishment. And that's kind of my mentality about Silksong at this point is that, like, yeah, is it better than Expedition 33 or Hi-Fi Rush or like Monster Hunter Wilds or like any of the other like games that have come out recently? Yeah, probably. But at the end of the day, that's not really what this game is competing with. Like it's competing with Nintendo. It's competing with Donkey Kong Bonanza, it's competing with Mario Kart World, it's competing with like all these really good high quality Nintendo games. Like when it comes to the games that actually matter, the games that people actually play, like Silksong comes out far, far short. Like it just isn't worth playing. If anything, I imagine going forward, the only people who will be interested in Silksong are people who love, 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 love Hollow Knight. And I expect that's going to be the reality of the situation going forward. Is that most of the people looking into getting to playing Silksong in the future are going to have to play Hollow Knight first. And I do think that is going to lead to this culture where this game is universally seen as not being as good as Hollow Knight. And that's kind of my mentality about this. This is kind of what I've been saying on streams, and this is something that I do think needs to be said is that this game is not as good as Hollow Knight. It's not as memorable. It doesn't have as good pacing. It doesn't have anything that made Hollow Knight work. It just feels like a bloated mess that doesn't come together in any way, shape, or form. Now, are there Good things about the game, certainly. I really enjoyed Mount Fay, the platforming challenge there, and I really enjoyed the beginning of Act 3 up until you leave the Abyss, because I feel like that had the best writing and the best character moments and just felt like the most like the creators had an idea about what they wanted to do with the game. But that doesn't excuse the rest of it. Like, I don't think 40 hours to get to this basic Act 3 that's just padding and just a rehash of everything you've been doing up to that point. I don't think necessarily that that is worth the time or investment. There were things I enjoyed about Act 3. Some of the character turns and some of the quests, some of the resolutions, like there were things that I liked about it, but at the end of the day, it's just kind of shocking kind of realizing that, like, wait a minute, this plot twist was ripped off from Bloodborne. This escape sequence was ripped off from Ori, right? Like, this boss was ripped off from Metroid Zero Mission. Like, it feels as if the creators just did not quite reach the point where they were able to create a completely original IP, because this feels very limited. It feels very uninspired. It feels very Dark Souls-ish. The fact that you're going around a map and ringing bells to open the area on top of the world, like, exactly like Dark Souls, right? Where is the creativity? Where's the charm? Where's, like, the excitement? Like, I don't understand why this game. So Farloom is supposed to be, right, like a more functional society than Hallownest, right? Because it's not post-apocalyptic yet. Like, there are actual towns, there are actual communities. Like, there are more NPCs around than there were in Hallownest, right? Like, really, the game should have had a brighter color palette and a tone. And then, like, going into Act 3, that's when it should have gotten messed up and ridiculous. But in practice, what ends up happening is, when because of the tone being so bleak and morbid, even from the get go, when the plot twist happens in Act 3, like, it doesn't really feel like all that much has changed. And I do think that's a real criticism of this game that I don't think anybody else would address, is that, like, it just feels as if the game tonally was obsessed with, like, recreating Hollow Knight without really coming up with something new, fresh, original, or exciting. Because at the core, at the end of the day, like, this game's plot is essentially the same as Hollow Knight's, where you go out, uh, beat this god character, and then just trigger something to go into an extended sequence to get the game's true ending. Like, it's just not that well made. It's not well paced. It's not engaging. It's not fun, and it is something we really need to talk about, because at this point, I feel as if the only reason anyone's giving this game the time of day is because it's a status symbol. I feel as if, for a lot of people, beating Hollow Knight is seen as a status symbol in the community, that it's entirely a stream bait thing, and they're not really looking at the game objectively. They're not really evaluating the themes, the story, the ideas, the mechanics, the gameplay, the world, the characters. Like, people aren't really processing the game's actual qualities. All they care about is that a hugely anticipated game launched on Steam, and that they can stream it and get a bunch of viewers on board to watch them fail at it. And I've seen this time and time again in this community. People who have no real interest in playing this game, who are just playing it because it'll get them views. And that's kind of my mentality on this, is that this is 100% a meme game. It is not on the same level of quality as what Nintendo puts out. It's not on the same level of quality as classic Metroid likes. It's not even as good as the original Hollow Knight. This is a game that has failed to live up to the hype that the original Hollow Knight set.